When my husband, Jake, and I moved into our new home just a week before Christmas, we were excited to finally settle down in a quiet neighborhood. The house was small but charming, with a cozy fireplace and enough space for the two of us to start fresh. Our neighbors, the Garretts, a middle-aged couple living in the house directly next to ours, introduced themselves on our first day. Mr. Garrett was a wiry man with thin glasses and an unsettlingly fixed smile. His wife, Lydia, was soft-spoken, her eyes darting nervously whenever her husband spoke. They welcomed us with a tin of homemade cookies, and while everything about the interaction seemed polite, something felt off. At first, we tried to brush off the oddities. Everyone has their quirks, right? But as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. At night, through our thin walls, we could hear raised voices. Mr. Garrett's sharp, clipped tone and Lydia's softer, pleading responses. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, and other times it would go on for hours. During the day, the house seemed dead silent, with curtains drawn tight and no sign of Lydia anywhere. Jake joked that maybe she was just an introvert, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong behind those closed doors. A few days before Christmas Eve, things started getting stranger. I was in our kitchen washing dishes when I glanced out the window and saw Mr. Garrett standing in his backyard, completely still. He was staring at our house, not blinking, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. When he noticed me looking, he gave a small wave and walked back inside without breaking eye contact. That night, we heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across their floor, followed by a loud thud and silence. Jake tried to convince me it was nothing, but we were both too uneasy to sleep. On the morning of Christmas Eve, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find Mr. Garrett standing there, holding a bottle of wine and smiling that same thin, uncomfortable smile. "You two should come over for dinner tonight," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's Christmas Eve. Nobody should be alone." I stammered something about having plans, but he didn't seem to hear me. He just pressed the wine bottle into my hands and said, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." Then he turned and walked back to his house without waiting for an answer. I closed the door and locked it, my heart racing. Something about the way he spoke, like it wasn't a suggestion, but an order, left a knot in my stomach. Jake and I sat in the living room that evening, the unopened wine bottle sitting ominously on our coffee table. Neither of us spoke much. The weight of Mr. Garrett's invitation hung heavy in the air. "We can't go," Jake said finally, his voice low. "Something's not right over there." I nodded, relieved he felt the same way. But as the clock crept closer to 8, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I peeked out the front window and saw their house dark, except for a faint glow coming from a single room upstairs. At exactly 8:05, there was another knock on our door. Not loud, not frantic, just 3 slow, deliberate taps. I froze and Jake's eyes met mine. Neither of us moved. The knocking came again, followed by Mr. Garrett's voice, muffled through the wood. "It's rude to ignore an invitation, you know." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, until the sound of footsteps retreated from our porch. A minute later, our power flickered and went out completely, plunging the house into silence and darkness. Jake grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, his face pale in the bluish glow. "That's it," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "We're leaving. Right now." I didn't argue. We grabbed our coats, our keys, and our phones, moving cautiously toward the front door. But just as Jake reached for the doorknob, we both froze. Through the narrow frosted glass panel beside the door, we could see a shadow. Someone was standing there, motionless, blocking our only way out. For what felt like an eternity, we stood frozen in place. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted, and we heard faint footsteps retreating down our porch steps. Jake peeked through the curtains and whispered, "He's going back to his house." We didn't waste a second. We slipped out the back door into the freezing night air and hurried to our car parked in the driveway. But as we backed out, the headlights illuminated something chilling. Mr. Garrett, standing in his front yard, staring directly at us with his hands in his coat pockets and that same thin, eerie smile on his face. Behind him, the upstairs window glowed faintly, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure. Someone thin, someone small, standing just behind the curtains before they snapped shut. We didn't stop driving until we were a good 10 miles away, parked in an empty grocery store lot. Jake had his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Neither of us spoke for a while, both staring straight ahead, the only sound the faint hum of the engine. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We need to call the police. Something's seriously wrong over there." I nodded and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. I explained everything, the arguments, the strange behavior, the invitation, the figure in the window. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check on the Garrett's house. We sat in the car, waiting, staring at the dashboard clock as the minutes dragged by. Eventually, an officer called me back. His voice was calm but firm. "We checked the house. There's no one there. The place is completely empty." My stomach dropped. "Empty? How could that be?" I tried to explain again about the figure in the window, about Mr. Garrett standing in the yard, but the officer insisted the house was vacant. Furniture covered in sheets, dust on every surface, and no sign of anyone living there. "Are you sure this was the right address?" he asked. But I knew it was. We had been looking at that house every day for weeks. Jake and I didn't go back to the house that night. We checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, but neither of us got much sleep. The officer's words kept circling in my mind. "The house is empty. How could that be?" We had spoken to Mr. Garrett. I had seen him standing in the yard. We had heard the arguments, seen the lights flicker on and off. None of it made sense. The next morning, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I convinced Jake to drive back with me in daylight. Maybe seeing the house in the sun would make it all feel explainable somehow. When we pulled into our driveway, everything looked normal. Too normal. The Garrett's house sat quietly next door, the curtains drawn tight. Jake stayed in the car while I hesitantly approached their front porch. I knocked softly on the door once, twice. Nothing. But then, tucked under the welcome mat, I noticed something. A small, yellowed envelope. My name was written on it in shaky, uneven handwriting. My stomach twisted as I opened it. Inside was a single note: "You should have come to dinner. You'll always wonder what was on the table." I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps as I nearly stumbled down the steps. We left that house for good later that day, grabbing what little we could fit into the car and driving until the neighborhood was nothing but a memory in the rearview mirror. We never found out what happened in that house, who or what the Garretts really were, or what they had planned for us on Christmas Eve. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the faint sound of someone knocking, 3 slow, deliberate taps, somewhere far away, but always close enough to make my skin crawl. I've always taken the same shortcut home from my part-time job at the mall, a narrow, winding path through a small wooded park. During the day, it's peaceful, with kids playing on swings and joggers passing by. But at night, especially in winter when the snow blankets everything and the lamps cast weak, yellow light, it feels different. Quieter. Heavier. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when I first saw him. A man, standing perfectly still under one of those flickering lampposts. His posture was rigid, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his long coat, his face obscured by shadows. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just odd. I kept walking, pulling my scarf tighter around my neck and trying not to look back. But the next night, he was there again. Same lamppost, same unmoving stance. Only this time, he was closer, just a little further down the path. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I walked faster, boots crunching on the snow. I told myself it was a coincidence. People are weird sometimes, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face. Over the next few nights, he kept appearing. Always standing still, always under a lamppost, always just a little closer than before. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I'd started avoiding the shortcut altogether, taking the longer route along the main roads even though it added an extra 20 minutes to my walk. But that night was different. I'd stayed too late at a friend's holiday party, and snow had started falling heavily by the time I left. The streets were empty, the festive decorations glowing faintly under the thick snowfall. My phone was at 3% battery, and every route home felt unnervingly quiet. Against my better judgment, I decided to cut through the park. The path was eerily silent under the snow, and the faint crunch of my boots felt deafening in the stillness. Halfway through the shortcut, I saw him. He wasn't under a lamppost this time. He was standing further down the path, just at the edge of the tree line. I froze. His silhouette was sharp against the glow of a distant street lamp, and though his face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, I could feel his gaze fixed on me. Slowly, he shifted, one step forward, then another. I turned and walked briskly, trying to keep calm, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was following me. His steps were slow, deliberate, and unbroken. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I forced myself not to run, not yet. Running felt like admitting I was afraid, like it would trigger something in him. But with every step I took, he matched it. Steady, deliberate, unhurried. The snow was falling harder now, blurring my vision and muffling every sound. I glanced over my shoulder again, and my stomach dropped. He was closer, much closer. I could see the faint outline of his face in the flickering light of a nearby lamppost. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and lips that looked almost smiling. I snapped. My body took over and I ran. I didn't care about the noise, about slipping on the ice, or about looking back. I just ran. Branches scraped my face as I veered off the path, into the trees, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, and the snow clung to my jeans, soaking through to my skin. Behind me, I could hear it, the steady crunch of footsteps following me. He wasn't running, but he didn't need to. His pace was relentless, and no matter how fast I went, it felt like he was always just a few steps behind. My lungs were on fire, and my legs felt heavy as I pushed forward through the snow-covered trees. Every few seconds, I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he was always there, close enough that I could see the glint of his eyes in the faint moonlight. I didn't understand how he was keeping up without running, without even seeming to try. My brain screamed at me to keep moving, but the cold and exhaustion were starting to win. Then, through the trees, I saw it. The faint glow of a street lamp near the park's exit. My house wasn't far beyond that. I pushed myself harder, my boots slipping on the snow and ice. Behind me, his footsteps never faltered, never slowed. I could almost hear his breathing now, steady, measured, like he wasn't tired at all. The street lamp grew closer, and I could see the faint outline of the park gate beyond it. I was so close, but then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, my foot caught on something buried in the snow. A root, a rock, I don't know. I went down hard, my hands sinking into the freezing snow, my phone flying out of my pocket and skidding away. For one horrible second, I couldn't move, and then I felt it. A presence looming over me, the snow crunching softly as he stepped closer. Time slowed as I pushed myself up, my palms numb and wet from the snow. I could feel him standing just behind me, close enough that I swear I could hear the faint sound of his breathing. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing my phone from the snow and stumbling towards the lamppost and the park gate beyond it. I didn't look back, couldn't. The light from the street lamp washed over me as I finally reached the gate, shoving it open and spilling out onto the sidewalk. When I turned around, he was standing just at the edge of the lamppost's glow, perfectly still again. His head was tilted slightly, like he was curious. The snow fell thickly between us, and for a brief moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing into the night. I stood there, gasping for air, my knees trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. Somehow, I managed to make it home, lock every door and window, and collapse on the floor of my living room. still wearing my wet coat and boots. Christmas dinner was in full swing at my parents' house. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon filled the air, and the living room was a mess of wrapping paper, scattered gifts, and half-finished mugs of cocoa. My younger cousins were fighting over a remote. My aunt was telling some long-winded story about her neighbor's cat, and for a brief moment, it felt like one of those perfect holiday scenes from a movie. But then came the knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that cut through the chatter and laughter. Dad was the one who answered it. Standing in the doorway was a man, mid-30s maybe, wearing a long coat, a beanie, and thick leather gloves. Snowflakes clung to his shoulders, and his breath fogged in the cold night air. "Sorry to bother you folks," he said with an apologetic smile, his voice low and steady. "My car broke down just up the road. The snow's getting worse, and I don't have anywhere warm to wait for a tow." There was a pause, a collective hesitation from everyone in the room. But it was Christmas, and leaving someone out in that weather felt cruel. "Come in, warm up," Dad said, stepping aside. The man stepped inside, shaking snow from his shoulders and glancing around the room with sharp, assessing eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, his smile polite but tight. My mom bustled over with a spare blanket and offered him a mug of cocoa, while Dad asked a few casual questions about his car, what kind, how far up the road, if he'd already called for help. The man answered each question simply, without elaborating. "It's an old sedan," he said. "Slid off near the bend. Tow truck's on the way." His gloved hands stayed wrapped around the cocoa mug, and even when he sat down in the corner armchair, he didn't remove them. At first, he blended in surprisingly well. He laughed lightly at my uncle's corny jokes, nodded along as my aunt complained about holiday traffic, and even complimented the tree. But there was something about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. He was too still, too observant. While everyone else was caught up in the usual Christmas chaos, his eyes kept moving, flicking from person to person, room to room, as if he were cataloging things. When my little cousin Sarah handed him a sugar cookie, he took it with a gloved hand and only pretended to take a bite before setting it aside. As the evening wore on, the man seemed to fade into the background, which somehow made him even more unsettling. He didn't engage much but never felt out of place either, like he belonged just enough to avoid drawing suspicion. At one point, I noticed him watching my mom as she cleared plates from the table. His head tilted slightly, his eyes sharp. When she turned around, he quickly looked down at his cocoa, stirring it absently with a spoon. The gloves stayed on, even as the fireplace crackled nearby and everyone else had started loosening their collars and rolling up sleeves from the heat. Later, while helping Dad grab some extra wine bottles from the garage, I brought it up. "That guy's weird," I said quietly. Dad gave me a look but didn't immediately dismiss me. "He's probably just cold and embarrassed about his car breaking down," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. We both stood there for a moment in the dim light of the garage, snow blowing against the small window. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, but deep down I knew something was wrong. When we went back inside, the man was gone from his chair. The man's absence wasn't immediately noticed. With the noise of the kids playing, the adults chatting, and Christmas music humming softly from the speakers, it took a few minutes for anyone to realize he was gone. I spotted it first. His mug of cocoa sat untouched on the side table, still half full, and the blanket my mom had given him was draped neatly over the arm of the chair. "Where'd he go?" I asked, my voice low. Dad looked around, brow furrowed. Maybe he went outside to check on his car, but the front door was still locked, the snow on the welcome mat undisturbed. A cold, sinking feeling crept into my chest. My mom called out, "Sir, are you still here?" Silence. My uncle joked nervously about ghosts, but no one laughed. Dad began checking rooms, the bathroom, the kitchen, even the garage, but there was no sign of him. That's when my little cousin Sarah tugged on my sleeve. Her face was pale, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw him go upstairs. Every head in the room turned toward the staircase, the soft glow of holiday lights reflecting off the banister. The air felt thick, heavy. Someone was still in the house. No one spoke as we stared at the staircase. The faint hum of Christmas music from the speaker felt distant now, almost mocking. Dad was the first to move, grabbing the fireplace poker with trembling hands. "Stay here," he said firmly, his voice barely above a whisper. But no one stayed put. My uncle followed him, then me, and finally my mom. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed, each step louder than the last in the dead silence of the house. When we reached the hallway, the faint glow from the tree downstairs barely reached us. The doors to the bedrooms were all slightly ajar, shadows spilling out into the corridor. "Check each room," Dad said, his knuckles white around the poker. Slowly, one by one, we pushed open the doors. My parents' room, empty. My little cousin's room, empty. The guest room, empty. But when we reached the last door, the attic pull-down hatch, it was slightly open, the string dangling down like an invitation. Dad hesitated, staring up at the attic hatch, his breathing shallow. The string swayed slightly, as if someone had just climbed up or down. No one spoke. My uncle whispered, "We should call the police," but Dad shook his head, his voice trembling. "If he's still up there, I want to know now." With a deep breath, he grabbed the string and pulled. The ladder creaked as it unfolded, and a cold draft spilled down from the attic. Dad started climbing, the fireplace poker clenched tightly in one hand. I followed close behind, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear anything else. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single, dirty window at the far end. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and old Christmas decorations were scattered around. But then I saw it, an open space near the far corner, where insulation had been pushed aside to create a small nest of blankets and empty food wrappers. And next to it, something gleamed faintly in the dim light. A knife, carefully placed on top of one of the blankets. The sight of the knife froze me in place. Dad held the fireplace poker out in front of him, his head turning sharply as he scanned the shadows. "Is anyone here?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. Silence. The attic felt impossibly still, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere behind the stacks of boxes, there was a faint sound, a slow, deliberate exhale. We both turned at the same time, our flashlight beams cutting through the dusty air. And there he was, the man. He was crouched low behind the boxes, his gloves still on, his pale face partially illuminated by the thin light from the window. He was staring right at us, his lips pulled into that same tight, polite smile. Slowly, he brought one gloved finger to his lips.